Hi, everyone. My name is Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of NVO Experience here at NICEX and former executive of Hapag Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And I'm Caroline Weaver, Senior Account Manager here at NICEX, and you're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Don, how was your weekend?
Oh, yeah, it was actually pretty good. It's been pretty great summer here. I'm very sad that summer's winding down here in the New York area, but we've been very fortunate. It actually hasn't been too hot here, so it's been pretty glorious. And yeah, I have this bum ankle that I've been able to run on a little bit, so life's good. But how about yourself?
It's good. Yeah, I'm in Austin, Texas, so it's about 105 every day, but forecast looks like it's going to be easing up a bit. It'll be a high of like 99 in a couple days, so looking forward to that. But yeah, this weekend I stayed inside, sewed some pillow covers, and pretty easygoing weekend.
I do enjoy that 99 degrees is like easing up, because
Yes.
most of us in this area would melt. But listen, I'm really excited for this episode because when I think about this, it makes me a little bit nostalgic. It reminds me I grew up in Chicago, and a significant date for me was March 18th, 1995, and that's when I don't know if you weren't alive, but maybe you heard about it. Is that this athlete? His name was Michael Jordan. He decided to return to basketball, and he just said a two-word fax in as his press release, and it just said, "I'm back," after a 17-month break, and everyone in the Chicago area was going bonkers. I'm sure everyone in the supply chain is going bonkers too, because today on this episode, back and better than ever, Mr. Bryan Most. Bryan Most, welcome back to Supply Chain Secrets. How the heck are you?
Hey, thank you, Don and Caroline, for that. I think that's probably the first and only time I'll be associated with Michael Jordan. That's for sure. And I'm not sure how many people are going crazy, but I am. I am certainly happy to be back. First of all, congratulations to you guys for keeping the podcast going, and Caroline for dealing with Don for all that time. But you guys have done a great job with it, so congrats. But no, thanks for having me back, and I'm very excited.
Yeah, well, Brian, you're always going to be the podfather as far as we're concerned. So, like, you'll never lose that title. So, I mean, I know everyone usually refers to you as the podfather, and I certainly will for the rest of my life.
Well, once again, probably a term that will only be associated with me one and only time.
So, so, Brian, why don't you talk a little bit about like what you've been up to, what you've been doing? I mean, you've been away from us for a while, and now you're back and better than ever. So, why don't you just share with the listeners what that experience has been like so far?
Yeah, happy to. For those that don't know me, I've been in supply chain and logistics for almost 30 years. It sounds crazy to kind of say it that way, but it's been a wonderful ride with great people, great relationships, and certainly plenty of problems to solve along the way. I was lucky enough to start my career way back when with a management training program at Sealand Service. So I started my career on the service provider, ocean carrier side, and through a number of commercial roles, got involved with some of our top customers, of which Walmart was one, and they gave me the opportunity to try the BCO or shipper side of the supply chain, and I had a chance to help them set up their international and global logistics network over the period of about 21 years, and also did some time on the domestic side with their private truck fleet and deliveries to stores and clubs, which was a blast. And then I got a chance to jump into technology with you fine folks at NICEX, and what a great learning opportunity. Had so much fun seeing and trying to solve some of the problems in the industry from a different perspective. And then the last year and a half or so has been back on the service provider side, just trying to reacquaint myself with how service providers are changing and adapting kind of post COVID, and what they're looking at on how they're going to serve customers in the future. So it's been a lot of fun. It's given me a chance to broaden my background, and coming back to NICEX in an advisory role is kind of what I want to do. So I've got to stay up to date on everything that's going on, all things supply chain.
I'm curious to hear more about what you observed in your time away from NICEX in terms of shipper or BCO behavior.
Yeah, I mean it's been pretty interesting, right? I mean, I focused on the service provider side of the business, and so maybe I'll start there, and some of the things that I've seen kind of evolve from that perspective. Without a doubt, the customer has become the center of a lot of activities, which some BCOs might not feel that way or think that way. That service providers are focusing on them, but without a doubt, I think service providers are seeing that customer relationships, customer service, and having the customer at the center of everything they're doing is going to be a key differentiating factor in the future. And then, quickly behind the customer is just driving efficient operations. I think there's no surprise that it's a very challenging, environment right now for a lot of shippers and carriers. And I think carriers recognize that they've got to drive efficiencies in their operations if they want to drive cost savings and be sustainable for the long term. And I honestly think the landscape probably looks completely different 12 months than it does now, but we could probably do a whole podcast on that. I've also seen a lot of different kind of value added services starting to be kind of tied together. I think service providers have realized that there are things they can do on behalf of their shipper customers to expand services just beyond like core ocean freight. Say, I think the challenge is figuring out how you connect those in an effective way and offer them to your customers. That hopefully, obviously, drives cost savings and service improvement. But anyway, I see a lot of movement there. And then finally, I would just touch on technology, both for shippers and carriers. It's great to see kind of post pandemic a pretty big focus on technology and investing in supply chain technology to kind of help manage through shocks and other things in the future. So a lot of connectivity and investment being made in technology and partnerships with Silicon Valley and incubators and things like that. So it's pretty fun to see some things that I consider to be positive movements since I've been away.
Yeah, that's great. And when I think about your time away, I think it's just such a unique time in our lifetime as far as the shipping industry is concerned. Just because it was like pre-pandemic, then we had the pandemic, and now here we are post-pandemic. And when you think about that time, what surprised you the most? Is there anything that when you look back on it that you think, you didn't really see coming or you didn't expect now that you have a chance to like take a breath and look with the benefit of hindsight?
Yeah, and it's actually a really good question. I've had a little bit of time to think about that and kind of reassess now as I go into more of kind of advisory type roles. How do I help shippers and carriers manage through what these shocks may or may not look like in the future? It's hard to say anything surprises you after almost 30 years in this business, Don. You know that. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen. But without a doubt, I think just the market correction, without a doubt, surprised me. I was one that thought that it might be a bit more of a soft landing, so to speak. But just the speed with which the correction happened was a bit surprising to me, to be quite honest with you. I mean, if you think about it, there were new entrants that were entering into the Trans-Pacific market. Some gained, decent market share. You had some shippers that were leasing their own ships and containers, and all those things, very quickly started to become, solutions that didn't make sense either from a cost or a service perspective because of how quickly the market corrected. And most of those new entrants aren't even in the trade anymore, and most of the ships and containers that were leased by shippers or BCOs have been turned back in. So I think that certainly was surprising to me. And then I just think the other thing is there was just a ton of pressure because the economy itself started to stagnate. There was so much inventory that was kind of left over that I think people were just left trying to find cost savings in any means possible. And freight rates is kind of a quick and easy way to try and drive cost savings if the market dynamics, fit. And I think that was something else that surprised me, is how aggressively people had to go after cost savings just to try and survive.
Yeah, it seemed like people had to get creative in order to try to mitigate some of these rising costs.
No question.
So, what were some of the missed opportunities perhaps with all of these changes in the industry.
Yeah, I would tell you so. With the positive kind of movements and things that I talked about earlier, I would tell you one of the missed opportunities or disappointments would be a lot of the same problems and pain points that existed before the pandemic still exist today, even with a lot of investment and a lot of time and a lot of resources being put towards trying to resolve them. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot still persist, and what I mean by that is say maybe there were some positive movements made in visibility software, where people can actually see where their products are in the supply chain. However, when there are exceptions or whenever there are problems, there isn't a lot of context necessarily, or there isn't solutions or alternatives that are proactively presented that make continuing operations easy. I still see a lot of shippers and carriers struggling just to manage data and try to digitize the information in their supply chains. Don, this is a favorite one of ours. I still hear people trying to achieve one version of the truth out there, and it just ends up that a lot of resources are being still tied up in what I kind of call non-value added work, chasing errors, chasing exceptions, managing spreadsheets, and in general, just misaligned expectations between all parties that just, in my opinion, again, leads to a lot of waste versus driving efficiency.
Yeah, that's very interesting because when I think about that and I think about this topic of just missed opportunities, um, even though that like the we flipped the script a little bit, that before it was like couldn't find space anywhere, now space is available, rates are high, now rates are low. There's all these like inefficiencies that still persist, and I think even where I sit and working for NICEX, we've seen a lot of things that still are opportunities to fix things because we as a company have more or less turned into a data company. We started out as this forward contract, which was something very specific for a specific week, a specific ship. Then we evolved into this two-way committed contract, which was something much broader, but I think very powerful and very timely when that came out. And then we turned into this powered by NICEX type of company, which now we're supporting other carriers' contracts. So it's not just a NICEX contract. And now we're landing at a place to say, we've really collected all this data now. And we're finding that this is something that shippers and carriers actually both find interesting and helpful. So even if we can take the carrier's data and then put some other data from other sources on there, enrich that data and repurpose it and provide it back to the carrier, is actually pretty interesting. And I think from my perspective, there's like four key areas that we've landed on where there's still opportunity based on everything we're doing in the space of contract management. I think that's always been core to what we've been doing. We've been doing a lot in the allocation management space, but also the forecasting space, which talk about spending an entire podcast episode. I can't tell you how many times in my life I've been working on a forecast. And just anyway, I don't want to try and unpeel that here, but just a topic I'm super passionate about. But just operational issues, these things where you see you're not fully managing your space, or maybe you're not getting containers on time, you're not shipping on time or when you thought it was going to happen due to blank sailings, et cetera. And then cost avoidance, right? This has been a significant issue, particularly for shippers, because again, there's a lot of change and I think these things still persist. But from where I sit, I think those are like four key things that we're trying to help with because they still exist in the market. But, Caroline, I'd love to hear your perspective. I mean, you got Bryan and I are like dinosaurs in the industry almost. You come in with this fresh perspective, but do you see it the same way or how would you describe it?
Yeah, well, I've always felt that NICEX is very uniquely positioned, being at this intersection of working with shippers, BCOs, and working with ocean carriers as well as NVOs. We get to see all of the different perspectives and pain points that they all have. And over the past 6 months or so, we've been quietly piloting some tech, getting feedback in order to learn more about these pain points, because we've always been laser focused on the ocean contracting space and life cycle. So with that, we've been able to gather feedback and work more closely with the ocean carriers with some custom integrations, and really hone in on this idea of the digital infrastructure supporting ocean contracting and performance.
I think what Caroline said there is key, right? I mean, somebody like NISHEX being at the intersection of these stakeholders. It was also clear to me, over the last couple of years that these topics, Don, that you talk about are absolutely important to both shippers and carriers and NVOs, but in a lot of cases, they're being worked on in isolation. So, in other words, you may have a shipper or a shipper's group, working to try and solve, one pain point, or you may have a particular carrier, maybe a leading carrier in the industry, trying to come up with their own solution to one of the pain points. And then the challenge is then, how do you kind of gain enough adoption? And people were worried about competitive forces and what have you, but a lot of the things you talk about are not really competitive issues. I mean, these are issues that if worked on together, could actually, right, drive the industry in a positive way. And again, if you can start to take some of that inefficiency out, I mean, ultimately, I think everybody starts to benefit from that. But I think that's the key is how do you find somebody with the influence and the technology, and as you say, Caroline, at the intersection of these stakeholders, to be able to actually pull something like this together.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking, Brian, I think about this whole idea of solutions, and the problem is that carriers do try and come up with their own solutions. The challenge is that for you, if you're a shipper, like how do you cope with that? Because if it's just okay, it's carrier A solution, and they try to develop these things, and now carrier B is coming up with a similar solution, but they're not exactly the same. And I think what we found, I mean, I in the time away, Brian, I found myself talking about things I never expected to really even think about. For instance, when we talk about carrier schedules and how ships get bucketed, and I say, okay, well, I look at a calendar, I know when week 33 is, but I don't know how a carrier bucketed that ship because they did it based on a schedule. And the question is like, well, when does that schedule start? Does it start on the first port of call, on the last port of call? Like, do they look at it consistently across different trades? And these are like different kinds of nuances. And it might sound like, people are listening to me falling asleep. But the problem is, if you don't pay attention to these kinds of details, it's very difficult for you to unpack and unpeel what somebody is saying to you. And then for you as a shipper, if I look at it from the start of sailing, Caroline looks at it from the end of sailing, we are two different carriers. Then what are you to do as a shipper? You're just frustrated, I imagine, at the end of the day, which is why I think being this sort of neutral entity that's like consuming all this data, we can help because we can actually inform people. Because I mean, my experience at a carrier was I never thought about these things. I just said like, I don't know, it says week 33, it must be week 33. But was it different across carriers? Was it different for what the shipper experience was like? I wasn't aware of that. But what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think again that inconsistency is what kind of drives towards this notion of inefficiency, because with a lack of consistency, again, this is where your expectations become misaligned. Because again, is it this day of the week? Is it this calendar week? Is it whatever? But then your measurements become misaligned, and then again, this whole thing of how can you know if whatever agreement you put in place is actually performing the way it's supposed to, whether you're the shipper or carrier or NVO? Again, if you can't even agree on the core elements that are supposed to govern, right, the agreement, and then you certainly can't measure it, and then you can't necessarily, tell how, all parties have performed. So without a doubt, it seems crazy because it seems like we talked about these things, years ago, but I think that just speaks to the opportunity, right? I mean, the big question that I've asked myself is You go through something like COVID, the industry goes through incredible pain. Like, I mean, there was pain all the way around, a lot of investment, a lot of change. It created this opportunity for people to open their minds to do things differently. And the question is, are we better off, or are we better positioned to manage through something similar the next time around? And certainly there's a ton of learnings. Certainly there's some things that we can improve upon, but have we taken that big of a leap forward to say if COVID were to happen this fall, that we wouldn't see similar shocks and challenges? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the and I'd love to get Caroline's thoughts here on this, but I just want to say that I think going forward, there's still these things that are happening. For example, we look at how the industry's controlling their capacity because they look at the current market environment and say, my ships aren't fully utilized. And I think that's something that was here before. Like obviously during COVID, things were exploding, right? Every ship that was available was on the ocean. So it was real easy. You just put as many ships out there as you can. You saw these new entrants that you talked about earlier, and now they've gone away. And now you see this capacity discipline. And I think that means certain things for shippers when you have those types of things. And we can say that things have changed. Like people are working from home. We have this whole hybrid schedule, which never existed before. And I think there's a lot of new data elements, a lot of new things that exist out there that you're able to do that maybe you weren't able to do, 3, 5, 6 years ago. But I think all of that accelerated by what was happening with COVID. And I think now you're at a place where you could do things that you just couldn't do before. But, Caroline, I feel like you're knee deep in a lot of these types of issues. But what's your reaction to what we've said so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think these sorts of situations are not necessarily avoidable. COVID is obviously a very dramatic example of it, but you'll have issues that come up in supply chain for the rest of eternity. So it's really figuring out how to mitigate the impact. And I think there definitely have been improvements, but one of the big things, it seems to me at least, is the using technology in order to facilitate faster operations and knowing things where they're at, how to fix them faster, so you can speed up the amount of work that you're doing at once and get through it better.
I think Caroline brings up a really good point, Don, around this idea of, again, we've talked about this for a while, diversification and kind of resilience, right? You hear these terms a lot, but what does it really mean? And, if you just talk about diversification of how you import product, if you remember, everybody, for a period of time had, cargo coming into the West Coast. And then they were told, hey, the ILW is coming up. Like, you need to diversify. You need to go to the Gulf, or you need to go to the East Coast, because you need some options, and they need to be proven options. That way, if you need to use them, you can efficiently flow freight at any time. If somebody were to have taken that advice to the extreme and taken all of their freight from the West Coast and put it on the East Coast, now they'd be dealing with, a drought in the Panama Canal and wondering, why did I do that? I shifted all my cargo to the East Coast and was told that I wouldn't have any problems. Caroline's point, like, there's going to be these rolling shocks. There's always going to be something, whether it's weather, whether it's going to be labor, whether it's going to be who knows what, but there's always going to be something. So this idea of saying, you absolutely have got to build this diversification into your network over a period of time, so you can deal with it whenever it comes and wherever it comes.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, to that point, what's the next shot going to be? Nobody knows. But I think using technology to try and help you manage your supply chain can help bring efficiency and resilience to your supply chain. Because, I mean, if you look at something like allocation, and we could probably have a whole podcast, one on allocation and one on forecast. I don't know how many people want to listen to us talk about that, but I'm certainly very passionate about these things. But it's like, how do you know how much space you have available? Like, how do you know where that is? Whether it's to the East Coast or West Coast. When the strike was threatened on the West Coast, you were, putting all this pressure on the East Coast, but were you utilizing all the space available? And now with the Panama Canal, Okay, you might have space in the Suez Canal. Do you know if you're using up all your allocation there? Or conversely, like, are you using up all the space you have available? And again, why is this so complex? Well, some carriers look at it from point to point. They might say your space is allocated from Shanghai to LA, or they might say your space is allocated on, I don't know, TP6 or some loop.
If I'm a shipper right now, I know I've invested or I've at least started this journey with trying to bring some technology into my supply chain. But I know there's still, more to go, and I know there's still going to be challenges that I've got to overcome in the future. I mean, you have to be thinking that the opportunity to do that is got to be now, right? Or if you haven't started, like, to start now, because it's not very often that you as a shipper gets a chance to kind of navigate a year where, I mean, let's face it, there wasn't a ton of negotiation in rates. They just kind of ended up being what they were. The peak season in a lot of cases has been muted. There are minor supply chain challenges, with the exception of you know some weather issues here and there. And you might have a little bit of time to focus on something like my longer term strategy or my technology roadmap, or I do want to be better at forecasting, or I want to be better at allocation, because I know at some point the market will tighten back up again. And, Don, it wouldn't be a podcast if we didn't talk about being like a shipper of choice. So if there are things that you've, heard of or that you believe in that could cause you to be a shipper of choice, like, now would be the time, in my personal opinion, if you haven't done it already, to put some of those things in place before the market gets tight again and you're focused on other things other than your technology roadmap.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think now is the perfect time to do it because, I mean, one could argue and say, like, well, there's all this space available. I can go to my choice of carriers. But do you want to wait for the next crisis to do that? And I would argue, like, you don't, because you want to be more efficient when these types of things happen. And as we're talking, Brian, I'm sitting here wondering, I mean, you have a tremendous background as a shipper, and you have all this different, it might feel overwhelming that there's all these different technology options out there. And like, if I'm thinking about like how to differentiate people, how to make a decision of like who I partner with, like, what's top of mind for you if you put on your shipper hat for a second, and based on everything you've seen, how would you recommend somebody go about this? Because I imagine for some of our listeners, they're wondering, like, yeah, this all sounds great, but how do I get started? Like, what do I do? Because it probably feels a little overwhelming.
No, and it absolutely, could be overwhelming. And this is where ideally you'd like to go back to some type of internal roadmap or document or strategy that you've established that says, these are the things in my supply chain that I absolutely have to prioritize because they've either been underinvested in, underdeveloped, or just haven't existed, or we're about to enter a new era of things in our company that we're going to have to encounter that we haven't before. So you have this priority of things that you're truly focused on that drive the biggest return to you. And then you've truly got to look then for those partners that excel in those types of solutions. And a lot of times it becomes a priority, right? I mean, to do everything at once is extremely difficult. But if, for example, you say, hey, look, I've absolutely got to get better at forecasting because I know my growth is going to be this, and it's going to be in a part of the world where capacity typically is challenged. And if I don't do this well, there's an opportunity that I don't get the service levels I would expect. Those are things that you have to do internally with your own departments to figure out how you can figure out what your demand forecast is going to be at a much higher level of accuracy, at a detailed trade level or OD level, that then you can communicate in an effective way with your partners to then hopefully put together a solution that's effective. So whatever that particular pain point is or what you're working on, it needs to fall back into a bigger roadmap that's been supported by your internal leadership teams, because that's what will open up the investment and resources to actually go and make a difference.
Spoken like a true professional, Brian. I love it. That's awesome. Well, Caroline, I don't know. Do you have any other questions for Brian before we cut this guy loose, or do you want to pepper him with some more? I mean, we could probably sit here all day and just ask him stuff.
No, I think he's provided a lot of really useful insight. It's always great having some experts on this podcast. So thanks, Brian, for joining us.
No, hey, it's been fun. If you have me back, I'd love to do it. And Don, it'd be great too. I mean, if you get any feedback or comments on some of the areas that we've talked about, happy to do a deep dive and some practical advice on, how maybe you could go about solving some of them. But it's fun to get back with you guys. Again, you guys are crushing it. Great job. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, no problem, Brian. And I mean, my belief is that we should just have some regular content. I think between the three of us, just talking about the industry and stuff. I think it's great having you back. It's also great to have Caroline's perspective and to keep us honest. I'm like, wait a minute, you're losing half of your audience because they haven't been around for as long as you guys. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But to our listeners, I mean, give us feedback. We always like to hear from you as far as like topics you want us to cover, or actually just today I got some feedback on one of our episodes, and I think it's just very encouraging whenever people tell us like, hey, this I thought was great, it was very insightful. So again, listeners, DM us, find us. We encourage you to reach out, and don't forget, wherever you find our podcast, Apple, Spotify, rate us, review us, give us a rating, and let us know what you think, and we'll keep producing that content. So thanks for listening, everybody, and hope you enjoyed the show.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.